Mercer Industrial Systems lived inside a tower of glass and white stone, and at almost midnight that floor still glowed with the cold, careful light of a place that did not believe in rest. The corridors on the executive level were polished to the kind of shine that made every footstep echo. Black marble met pale walls, and somewhere behind the closed doors of a strategy room, a young woman was rehearsing the morning that would either crown her or undo her. Seraphina Reed stepped out of that room with the ease of someone who had never been told no in this building. Her dark green dress fell perfectly over her shoulders, the V at the neck cut low enough to read as confidence, never accident. Her hair was loose, brushed back from a face that had learned, year by year, to give nothing away. Behind her trailed Leo Bennett, her assistant, a thin tablet pressed to his chest, and two department heads who had stayed late because she had stayed late. She did not see Carter Bellamy at first. He stood at the end of the corridor in a slightly creased shirt, his shoes scuffed at the toes, and he carried two things. In one hand, he held a thick gray folder, neatly tabbed. In the other, he held his daughter. Matilda Bellamy was 6 years old, her cheeks flushed from a low fever, her arms wrapped around a stuffed rabbit so worn the seams had gone white. She buried her face into her father's shoulder when she saw the bright lights, then peeked out again, because children always did. Carter took one careful step forward. "Miss Reed," he said, in a voice that was not loud and not pleading, "I need 2 minutes." Seraphina's gaze swept over him, then over the child, then over the folder. She saw, in that order, a maintenance shirt, a sleeping rabbit, and an interruption. The folder, to her, was simply something he was using to justify being on a floor he should not be on. 2 minutes for what? She said. It was not a question, it was a sentence dressed as one. Batch D14, Carter said. The thermal sensors set to leave the dock at 11:55. The calibration data has been altered. If those units go into a cold chain medical line, the lag will not be caught until something is already lost. Matilda lifted her head at the sound of her father's serious voice. She did not understand the words, but she understood his tone, and her small fingers tightened on his collar. Seraphina did not look at the folder. She looked at the corridor, at the people now standing very still along its edges, and she made the calculation that a chief executive under pressure makes when she believes she cannot afford to flinch. She decided what this was. She decided he was an obstacle. "This floor is not a daycare," she said. The words were quiet, almost polite, and they landed harder than a shout. Henry Cole, the quality manager, stood near the elevator bank. He knew the calibration data better than anyone. He had signed the override that morning under instruction. He looked at the floor instead of at Carter. Carter's voice did not rise. "I'm not asking you to trust me," he said. "I'm asking you to read 3 pages." Seraphina took the folder from his hand. She lifted the cover, turned 2 sheets, and never let her eyes settle on a single line. Then, with a motion so practiced it almost looked casual, she pushed the folder back into his chest. The clasp gave. Pages spilled across the marble in a slow white fan. Matilda flinched. The rabbit slipped halfway out of her grip and dangled by one ear. In the silence that followed, no one moved. The 2 department heads kept their faces blank. Leo Bennett's lips parted, then closed. The security officer near the elevators shifted his weight once, then went still again. It was Matilda who finally spoke. Her voice was so small that Seraphina almost did not catch it. "Daddy," the child whispered, "did I make you get in trouble?" Something passed across Seraphina's face. It might have been a flicker of recognition. It might have been something closer to memory. Whatever it was, she pressed it down before it could become anything useful, and she straightened her shoulders. "You're done here," she said to Carter. "Hand in your badge. Security will walk you out." Carter did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He set Matilda gently on her feet, kept one hand on her shoulder so she would not feel alone, and unclipped the badge from his belt. He gave it to the officer without looking at him. Then he knelt and gathered the pages from the marble, one at a time, careful to keep them in order. When he stood up, he looked at Seraphina, and for the first time his voice carried. "By morning," he said, "you will understand what it costs to look at a person and only see how small they are." He turned the folder upright, lifted his daughter back into his arms, and walked into the elevator. The doors slid shut on the corridor, and on the silence he left behind. 6 hours earlier, before any of that had taken shape, Carter Bellamy had been making grilled cheese in a kitchen the size of a large closet. The apartment sat on the 3rd floor of a brick building 2 stops past the city's edge. It was not a beautiful place, but it was a careful one. A row of crayon drawings climbed the side of the refrigerator, each one signed with a backwards M. A pair of small sneakers sat by the door, laces tucked in to keep them from tripping their owner. On the counter beside the bread, a small white pill organizer held the week's allergy medicine, and a sticky note in his own handwriting reminded him to refill the inhaler before Friday. Carter moved through that kitchen the way he moved through most rooms, quietly, attentively, with the slight watchfulness of someone who had learned that the world could change in a single afternoon. The world had changed for him 3 years earlier, in a hospital corridor that he no longer described out loud. His wife had died of an infection that had been flagged on a chart no one read in time. The lab result had been routed to a folder marked low priority. A nurse's note had been entered after the shift change. A doctor had been carrying 20 cases that night. None of those people had wanted her to die. The system, however, had been built so that none of them had to be the one who saw her in time. After the funeral, after the lawyers, after the long, quiet months of holding Matilda while she asked when Mommy was coming back, Carter had not gone after revenge. He had gone after pattern. He became a risk operations specialist, the kind that companies hired quietly when their boards began to suspect that their dashboards were lying to them. He learned to read logs the way other people read faces. He learned that disasters almost never began with explosions. They began with a single line of data, softened by a single tired person under a single quiet pressure. He had stepped back from that work, mostly, when Matilda turned 4. The travel was impossible. The hours were worse. He took on smaller jobs, contract reviews, late-night audits, anything that let him be at the door when she came home from school. Then, 7 months ago, an old colleague had asked him to take a meeting with George Whitmore. That afternoon, the babysitter called to cancel. Matilda's fever was creeping up. Carter felt her forehead, gave her a chewable, and made the call he hated making. He could not skip his shift. He had a series of overnight checks scheduled, and one of them involved a batch he had been quietly watching for weeks. He packed her backpack with the rabbit, 2 books, a juice box, and a soft blanket. In the car, she asked, in her tired voice, whether she was making things harder for him. He looked at her in the rearview mirror and told her she had never made anything harder. She had only ever made things matter. At Mercer, he tucked her into the staff break room, pushed 2 chairs together to make a small bed, draped his jacket over her, and put the rabbit into her arms. She fell asleep within minutes. He kissed the top of her head, closed the door softly, and walked down to the technical floor. He logged into the system at exactly 7:53, and he opened the file marked Batch D14. The first thing Carter saw was a number that did not match. The thermal sensors in Batch D14 were a small, expensive line. They were destined for a national medical distributor that supplied pharmacy chains and hospital networks across 9 states. In a normal building, on a normal evening, the lag tolerance for those sensors would have been a footnote. In a cold chain medical environment, that lag was the difference between a working refrigerator and a freezer that had been quietly drifting out of range for 3 hours. Carter pulled the original calibration report. The status field read pending review. He pulled the version that had been pushed up to the approval system. That field read reviewed and cleared. He checked the timestamp on the change. The clearance had been entered at 4:51 in the afternoon, 23 minutes after the review window had been formally locked. That was not a clerical error. That was someone walking back into a room that was supposed to be closed and changing the wall. He cross-referenced the server log, the warehouse manifest, and the automated quality record. All 3 confirmed the same thing. The data had been corrected after the fact, by a credential that did not have native authority to do it. He did not move for almost a full minute. Then he lifted the phone and called Henry Cole. Henry answered on the 5th ring, his voice already tight, already braced. Carter asked him a single question. Did you sign off on Batch D14, or did someone else sign it under your name? There was a long pause. Then Henry's answer arrived, indirect and careful and thoroughly afraid. It's complicated, he said. There's pressure from upstairs. The board meeting is tomorrow. No one wants to stop this shipment. Henry, Carter said gently, do you know where these sensors are going? The silence on the other end of the line was its own answer. Carter tried the proper channels first. He sent a flagged email to quality, to logistics, to operations approval. He marked it urgent and attached the comparison documents. Within 15 minutes, the responses began to drift back. One promised to look at it in the morning. Another forwarded the message up a chain that did not include anyone with the authority to halt the shipment. A third asked, almost politely, whether this could wait until after the board presentation. The shipment was due to leave the dock at 11:55. Carter walked back upstairs, opened the door of the break room, and looked at his sleeping daughter. He stood there for a long moment, with one hand on the doorframe. He thought about the hospital. He thought about the chart no one had read in time. He thought about every system he had ever investigated, and how each one of them had turned, in the end, on whether a single person had been brave enough to be inconvenient. He printed the full evidence stack, slid it into a folder, lifted his sleeping daughter into his arms, and pressed the button for the executive elevator. Up on the 43rd floor, Serafina Reed had spent the last 4 hours building a story. It was a beautiful story, full of clean numbers and confident projections. On-time shipments were up, inspection costs were down, quality incidents had remained, on paper, almost invisible. In the morning, she would stand in front of the board and ask for a wider operations mandate, the kind that would let her run sales, manufacturing, and quality under a single voice, her voice. She had not always wanted to be that voice. When she had first come to Mercer, she had been a young analyst with strong opinions about safety thresholds and a stubborn habit of writing memos that older men did not want to read. She had been teased for those memos. She had been told, in the gentle way men sometimes told women, that her instincts were charming, but her tone was unfortunate. She had learned to change her tone. She had learned to change a great many things. Somewhere along that path, she had stopped seeing the difference between holding her ground and refusing to be slowed. She did not anymore separate caution from softness. Softness, in her file, was filed under risk. When Carter Bellamy stepped into her corridor with a folder and a child in his arms, Serafina did not see a man who was warning her. She saw a man whose presence threatened the rhythm of her morning. The folder was not data, the folder was friction. She had expected, when she pushed it back into his chest, that he would shout. Most men did. The ones who did not shout cried. Both were easy to dismiss. What she had not expected was the quiet. He had not raised his voice. He had not begged. He had knelt and picked up his pages, and he had told her that by morning she would understand what it cost to look at a person and only see how small they were. For one strange second, standing there on the polished floor, she had almost felt cold. Then she had walked back to her office, closed the door, and decided that the cold was tiredness. Down in the parking garage, the rain had begun. Carter buckled Matilda into the back seat, adjusted the heat to a steady warmth, and tucked the rabbit under her arm. Her eyes were heavy with the strange exhaustion of a child who had been awake for things she did not understand. She watched him for a while in the dim light of the cabin. Then she said very softly, "Did I make her angry, Daddy?" Carter knelt by the open door, so his face was level with hers. He did not lie. "No, sweetheart," he said. "You didn't make anyone angry. Sometimes grown-ups treat people badly because they're scared. That isn't your fault. It's never your fault when adults behave that way." She thought about that for a moment. Why was she scared? "Because of what I was bringing her," he said. "What were you bringing?" "The truth," he said, and brushed her hair back from her forehead. "Some people are afraid of it. That doesn't mean we stop bringing it." She nodded the way small children nod when they have decided to trust an answer they do not fully understand. Within a few minutes, her breathing had slowed. Carter closed the back door carefully, slid into the front seat, and opened his laptop. He did not look like a man who had just been fired. He looked like a man who had been waiting for the right window. His fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced calm. He pulled together a single document, 8 pages, no rhetoric, the original calibration report. The altered clearance record, the timestamp on the rewrite, after the lock, the thread of internal emails, in chronological order, that had pushed quality to manage their findings against commercial impact. The notes from his call with Henry Cole. The list of names of every person who had stood in the corridor when Serafina had thrown the folder back into his chest. A short, dry assessment of what the lag in those sensors would do inside a vaccine refrigerator over a single hot weekend. Then, from inside an encrypted client, he opened a channel he had not used in 7 months. The address line had 2 recipients on it: George Whitmore, Constance Wells. He kept the message short. He was not asking for reinstatement. He was not asking for damages. He was not asking for anything personal at all. He was asking the board to halt batch D14 before it left the dock and to open a formal review of the calibration override pattern. The last line of the email was a single sentence. He typed it carefully. "I do not want Mercer to become the kind of company its founders once promised it would never be." He pressed send. The screen blinked and confirmed the delivery. He sat back, closed his eyes, and listened to the rain hit the concrete above the car. In the back seat, his daughter slept with one hand wrapped around the rabbit's foot. Outside, somewhere up in the building above him, a chief executive was pouring herself a glass of wine and believing she had handled it. The penthouse on the 41st floor had a wall of glass that turned the city into a long grid of light. Serafina set her glass down on the marble counter and opened her laptop. The slide deck was still on screen. The numbers still looked beautiful. She read them the way a sculptor reads the line of her own piece, with private satisfaction. A message arrived from Leo Bennett. Was the situation with Carter Bellamy resolved? She typed back 2 words. Handled it. She did not hear the small click of those 2 words landing somewhere they could not be retrieved. At 12:52 in the morning, her calendar pinged with a new entry. Emergency board session. 7:45. Mandatory attendance. She frowned briefly. She assumed it was a pre-alignment meeting before the formal session at 9. She considered, for perhaps 3 seconds, calling George Whitmore to confirm. Then she decided that he would only think she was nervous if she called. She walked to the bathroom mirror and stood there longer than usual. Her own reflection looked back at her, polished and lit and perfectly turned out. For a moment she remembered the analyst she had once been, the one who had filed memos no one wanted to read, who had cared about thresholds and tolerances and the small, ugly truths buried inside good-looking dashboards. She wondered when, exactly, that woman had stopped showing up to work. Then she turned out the light. Across the city, in a quiet study lined with old books, George Whitmore had finished reading Carter's email. He set the printed pages flat on his desk, rested his hands on top of them, and looked at Constance Wells, who had been waiting in the chair across from him. 7:45, he said. We do not wait. The next morning, Serafina arrived at Mercer at exactly 7:20. She wore a charcoal dress, a single strand of pearls, and the kind of composure that had been built over 1,000 mornings. The building, however, did not feel the same. The air did not arrange itself around her the way it usually did. The receptionist on the ground floor looked at her, and then quickly backed down at her screen. A middle manager near the elevator pretended to be reading his phone. By the time she stepped onto the executive floor, the silence had become its own information. She did not yet know what it was telling her. When the elevator doors opened on the 43rd floor, she saw 2 extra security officers near the boardroom. The room itself was already lit. George Whitmore was at the head of the long table. Constance Wells was at his right, a bound stack of documents in front of her. Vivian Reed, the senior independent director, was reading something on a tablet with her glasses low on her nose. Leo Bennett stood near the window, his posture too straight, his jaw a little tight. And Carter Bellamy was in the room. He was wearing a charcoal suit that fit him properly. His shirt was clean. His shoes were polished. He looked, to anyone who had not seen him the night before, like a man who belonged in any boardroom in the country. But it was not the suit that made Serafina pause in the doorway. It was the way he was sitting. He was not anxious. He was not triumphant. He was simply present, the way a person is present when he has been waiting a long time for a conversation to finally begin. "What is he doing here?" Serafina said. George did not answer right away. He motioned to the security officer to close the door. The latch caught with a small, definite sound, and Serafina understood, in the way one understands sudden weather, that this room had not been called to hear her present. It had been called to consider her. George folded his hands on the table. "Last night," he said, "you fired the only person in this company who still put safety above his own career. It is time you understood who Carter Bellamy actually is." Serafina sat down because her body decided to before her mind did. George spoke without theatrics. He explained, in a measured voice, that the board had been receiving signals for almost 6 months. Quality had been losing senior people at a rate that did not match the rest of the building. Anonymous reports had begun to surface, each one careful, each one quiet, each one suggesting that safety findings were being sanded down to fit commercial deadlines. Formal audits, however, kept returning clean results. Too clean. The kind of clean that suggested that someone always knew when the audit was coming. The board could not bring in an outside investigator without alerting the very system that had learned to clean itself. So they had asked for a quieter kind of help. They had asked for someone who could walk into the building from the bottom and watch. Carter, George said, had been that person. He had taken the role of a maintenance contractor with a flexible night shift. He had spent 7 months reading the building the way only a former auditor could read a building. He had eaten in the cafeteria. He had listened to the way people went quiet when certain managers walked past. He had watched what happened when warnings were filed, and what did not happen afterward. He had agreed to the assignment under one condition. If he ever found that the executive layer itself was the problem, he had the right to bypass the chief executive and report directly to the board through an encrypted channel. George had agreed to that condition. 7 months in, Carter had used it. Vivian Reed turned her tablet around so that everyone at the table could see the timestamps, the encrypted email, the original calibration report, the altered clearance entry, the internal email chain, the sensor lag analysis. It was Carter who finally spoke. His voice was calm and entirely without satisfaction. "I did not send that email to remove you," he said to Serafina. "I sent it because you chose to silence the warning instead of read it." Constance Wells slid the bound stack of documents into the center of the table and began. She spoke the way good lawyers spoke when they did not need to perform. She moved through the technical evidence first. 2 versions of the Batch D14 file appeared on the screen, side by side. The first read, "Pending review." The second read, "Reviewed and cleared." The clearance had been entered after the review window had been formally locked. There was no procedural path through which that change could have been an honest error. She then moved to the response curves. "The sensors in Batch D14, she said, fell within tolerance for general industrial use. They did not fall within tolerance for the medical cold chain application listed on the shipping manifest. In a high-volume vaccine refrigerator over a single warm weekend, the lag would be enough to allow a temperature excursion to go undetected long enough to compromise the load." Then she opened the email file. The messages did not say "sand the data." They never did. They said, instead, "Do not let delays distort the operational picture." They said, "Evaluate findings against commercial impact." They said any lag in clearance will be reviewed at the manager level. 11 days of careful, deniable language, layered over a quality team that had been losing senior people for almost a year. Then Constance opened the audio file. It was a brief internal call recording, captured on a system the company itself maintained for compliance purposes. Serafina's voice came through the speaker clearly, calm, controlled, almost tired. "Do not let the truth ruin a clean quarter." Leo Bennett was asked to confirm the voice. He looked at Serafina once. He looked at the table. Then he confirmed quietly that it was hers. Henry Cole's testimony came next, by phone. He admitted that quality had flagged calibration issues on more than one occasion and had been asked, each time, to revise their conclusions until the language fit the schedule. He said he had not gone to the board because he had not believed his voice would be heard against hers. He said he had been afraid of losing his job. He said, with audible shame, that he had children too. Serafina tried to defend herself. She pointed out, accurately, that she had never personally entered the altered clearance. She had only pushed for delivery. She had never told anyone to falsify. She had only set targets. She said Carter had bypassed procedure. She said his decision to bring his daughter onto the executive floor had emotionalized a routine operational dispute. The room cooled around that last sentence. Vivian Reed lifted her eyes from her tablet for the first time. If the person standing in front of you last night had been a 50-year-old vice president in a tailored suit, she said, would you have thrown his folder back into his chest? Serafina did not answer. She did not look down. She did not bristle. She simply stopped speaking, and the silence that followed was long enough for everyone in the room to hear it for what it was. It was Carter who finally said the sentence that would, later, be quoted back inside the company for years. A company can survive a bad quarter, he said. Very few survive a culture that teaches the people who see the danger to be afraid of saying it out loud. George asked Serafina to step out of the room. She rose. She walked, with all the composure she had ever cultivated, into the long glass corridor that overlooked the skyline. The city below her was just beginning the morning rush, indifferent and bright. For the first time in her career at Mercer, she stood on the wrong side of a closed door and waited for other people to decide what would be said about her. Inside the room, Vivian Reed looked at Carter. If we asked you to take this chair on an interim basis, she said, what would you do first? Carter did not answer with rhetoric. He answered with a list. He would halt batch D14 immediately. Not a single unit would leave the dock until an independent calibration audit had been completed. He would expand the review to every batch with a similar override pattern over the previous 12 months. He would bring in an outside investigator who reported directly to the board, not to the office of the chief executive. He would protect, in writing, every employee who had filed a warning or had been pressured into silence. He would pause every bonus structure tied to on-time shipment for any product line whose targets were currently in conflict with safety thresholds. He would rebuild the internal escalation system so that any employee, at any level, could route a safety, health, or data integrity concern directly to the board. He paused, then added one more thing. If the board only wanted a face to manage the public narrative, he was not interested. He would only accept the chair if he was given the authority to repair the system underneath it. George Whitmore looked once at Vivian. Vivian gave a small, decisive nod. Constance entered a single line into her notes. When Serafina was called back in, she walked to the same place she had stood a few minutes earlier, and she watched George read the resolution out loud. She was relieved of her duties as Chief Executive Officer with immediate effect. Carter Bellamy was named Interim Chief Executive Officer for 90 days, with a mandate to oversee the independent review and the reconstruction of the internal safety reporting system. Serafina did not crumble. She did not argue. She inclined her head once, the way a person inclines her head when she understands that the room has already moved past her. Outside the boardroom, in a small waiting area, Matilda Bellamy was sitting on a low chair with her rabbit on her lap and a sheet of paper in front of her. Someone had given her a green crayon. She was drawing a house with a chimney. When Carter stepped out of the boardroom, she looked up. "Daddy," she said, "are you still fired?" He sat down on the floor beside her chair so his face was level with hers. He was tired. He was not finished. He was not gloating. He smiled the soft, narrow smile of a man who had finally, after a long night, been allowed to exhale. "No, sweetheart," he said. "I just have a different office now." Carter did not begin his first day with a press release. He began it with an order to halt batch D14. The shipment was stopped before any unit cleared the dock. He signed a hold on every related part number. He authorized an independent calibration audit and gave it 72 hours. Then he opened the company-wide channel and sent a single short notice. He wrote that no one at Mercer would be punished for filing a safety report. He wrote that every previously closed warning would be reopened and reviewed. He wrote that any employee who had been pressured to alter data was invited to come forward and would be protected, in writing, by the board. He wrote that targets tied to delivery would no longer be measured in isolation from safety thresholds. He ended the message with a single sentence. No one at Mercer should ever have to choose between doing the right thing and protecting their family. The notice traveled through the building faster than any earnings update ever had. People read it twice. Some of them read it 3 times. Quality engineers who had stayed silent for years looked up from their desks and met each other's eyes for the first time in a long while. A junior analyst in compliance forwarded it to her father, who had spent 30 years in regulated manufacturing, and her father called her back and told her, voice rough, that he was proud of her for staying. Henry Cole wrote a private email to Carter that afternoon. He apologized for not speaking up sooner. He called his own silence cowardice. Carter's reply was short. He wrote that the old system had been engineered to make silence look like the safe choice. From this morning onward, their job was to make sure that was no longer true. Serafina Reed packed her office that afternoon. There were no jeers. No one made a show of her departure. The quiet that surrounded her was thicker than any humiliation would have been, because it was the quiet of a building that had stopped needing her permission to breathe. She set her pearls and her access card in a small box. She left the framed magazine cover on the wall. She did not look at it. Before she stepped into the elevator for the last time, she paused at the open door of the office that was no longer hers. Inside, Carter was bent over a stack of documents at the long desk, his sleeves rolled up, a black pen tucked behind one ear. On the small couch under the window, Matilda was asleep, her rabbit pressed under her chin, his suit jacket draped over her legs. For a long second, Serafina simply looked at them. She had told herself the night before that he had been weak for bringing his daughter into the building. Standing there now, she understood that he had not been weak at all. He had carried his entire small world into the corridor with him, and he had still chosen to bring the truth. She stepped into the elevator. She did not say goodbye. The doors closed on her reflection, and the building, after a moment, returned to its ordinary noise. People at Mercer would not, in the years that followed, mostly remember the numbers from that quarter. They would not even mostly remember that a chief executive had been replaced. What they would remember was the morning a man who had been thrown out of the building the night before walked back in, sat down in the most powerful chair in the company, and used his first hour not to punish anyone, but to make sure that no one at Mercer would ever again have to lose their job for telling the truth.